Well, today we are in Revelation chapter 20, a very important chapter for those who are looking forward to a millennial reign of Jesus. As you can see, in Revelation, he comes back at the beginning of the millennium. That's why we call ourselves, or I call myself anyway, premillennial. I don't know if you do. I trust most of you do, but premillennial means that Jesus comes back at the beginning of the kingdom and reigns and rules there for 1,000 years, just like Revelation 20 tells us here. So let's break this up into smaller bites, as is our habit. It helps us to kind of get through the chapter and understand what's going on. So in chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, we see the dragon, who's Satan. If you recall from earlier chapters, we see the dragon bound. And then we see the verses 4 through 6. We see the tribulation saints enter the millennial kingdom in verses 4 through 6. And then in verses 7 through 9, incredibly enough, Jerusalem is besieged after 1,000 years. Verse 10, we see the beginning of judgment here. So again, the satanic trinity is bound in the lake of fire, where they're tormented day and night forever in verse 10. And then we see general judgment of the unjust, the second death, in verses 11 through 15 through the end of the chapter then. So let's take a look at this closely. Notice in chapter 20, verse 2, that it says that the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, is bound for 1,000 years. So this 1,000 years is mentioned 6 times. Some of the critics of the view that this is a literal 1,000 years dismiss this as just a large number, referring to a interminable period of time. But it's clear that 6 times it says specifically 1,000 years. Sometimes they'll object by saying that this is shown nowhere else in the Bible. And that's true, but it's shown here 6 times. And as I said yesterday, this is a new revelation that the Old Testament saints didn't have. In fact, what they had was revelation about what this kingdom was going to be like. And then in the book of Revelation, we find out how long it's going to last. I'm going to give you a list of verses here. You might want to pause the video and get a pen and paper to write these down. These are Old Testament verses that describe what the kingdom is going to be like. So you might want to investigate this. Psalm 72, verses 1 through 20 describes this. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And then Micah chapter 4, verses 2 through 4 is a parallel to that. Several places in Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 9. Chapter 24, verses 21 through 23, and Isaiah 65, 17 through 25 is Isaiah's description of the coming millennial kingdom. Zechariah contributes to this picture of the kingdom as well. If you look in Zechariah chapter 8, verses 4 through 5, and Zechariah 14, verses 16 through 19. So these are just a sampling of the Old Testament verses. Again, they're describing conditions in the kingdom and not the duration that's left to Revelation 20, these verses that we're looking at. Also point out that one of the predominant features of the kingdom at this time is it seems to be an intermediate kingdom. So in other words, it's not the eternal state, which we'll see in chapters 21 and 22, but it is much better than the earth is today. So Jesus will be reigning. I'll tell you who else will be reigning here in a second. But Jesus will be reigning. He'll enforce righteousness and holiness on the earth for that 1,000 years during this intermediate kingdom. So in verses 4 through 6, then, we see those entering the kingdom. The tribulation saints will come in there. It's interesting when he talks about thrones. Up to this point, the thrones that we saw were thrones in heaven, occupied by the 24 elders. And up to chapter 19, verse 15, we saw Satan's throne on the earth. But at this point now, Satan has been displaced. He's bound, and we have these thrones set up. Who's going to be sitting on them? Well, Jesus will be enthroned. We see that in Matthew 25:31. We see the apostles will also be enthroned, reigning over the 12 tribes of Israel in Matthew 19:28. And then we see, it seems to me, anyway, I know this is another area where there's some disagreement among dispensationalists, but it looks like David will also be resurrected and enthroned. And I'd refer you to Ezekiel 37:24 to about 28 that describes David's enthronement there. So they'll be reigning on the earth for 1,000 years. Again, this might be a minority view, but I think Paul, the Apostle Paul, will also be reigning. He's the apostle to the Gentiles, and I think he'll have a throne as well over the Gentiles. So the 12 apostles over the 12 tribes of Israel, Paul over the Gentiles, David reigning, and then Jesus reigning as well during this time. Then we have a kind of an unexpected development here, beginning in verse 7. It says, when the 1,000 years is ended, Satan will be released from prison and will come out to deceive the nations. So after 1,000 years of prison, Satan is not rehabilitated. He hasn't changed his ways at all. He's been deceiving the nations throughout the book of Revelation, and he picks it up without missing a beat as soon as he's released. And he deceives these nations into besieging Jerusalem, as incredible as that may be. The common explanation that I've read and kind of go with it is that those people who have survived the tribulation enter into the millennial kingdom will have children. They'll continue to have children during the millennium. Some of those children will be unbelievers, essentially, and they will be deceived and go to war against Jerusalem, trying to unseat that ruling group of people there. Jerusalem here is described as a camp of the saints. This is actually a technical term, that camp, for a armed camp. So it looks like the saints have been preparing to be besieged, but as you can see, the fight doesn't last very long. They've suffered the same fate as Sodom and Gomorrah. Fire comes down from heaven and consumed them at the end of verse 9, with the result that Satan is bound. Verse 11, then, we begin what's called the white throne judgment. This is the second death. This is the resurrection of all the unrighteous at this point. Saw the dead and the great, the small, and they were judged by him who's sitting on the white throne. Notice at the end of verse 12, it says they're judged by what they do. So this judgment is not arbitrary. This judgment is based on what they deserve. It's a righteous, holy judgment. And as I've pointed out at various places in the book of Revelation, even during the tribulation, people will realize that it's the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, that's bringing judgment on the earth, and they will continue to resist him. They'll ask for the rocks to fall down on them to protect them. They will reject him. They will shake their fist against him all the way to hell, and that's what we see here at the end of chapter 20. So what we have in 21 then and 22 is what's called the eternal state. There's lots of misconceptions about what happens, whether we'll be in heaven or be on clouds, what's going on. I think that what the Bible is teaching us in these last two chapters is that the eternal state will be spent on a new heaven, under a new heaven, on a new earth. Something that's incredible, hard for John to describe and hard for us to understand. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Again, let's be looking forward to Jesus' millennial reign, for his coming, and may he find us prepared to to receive him or to be received by him at the rapture, so that we may reign with him in the millennium. God bless you.